what if our emotions, things that we think are ours to carry, feelings of pain and sadness and sorrow and grief and anxiety, uncertainty, dread, these heavy feelings, what if these are just echoes and reverberations of the earth that we can feel? And we mistakenly think that the depression that we're feeling, that the loneliness, the separation and isolation, the fracture, this longing for communion, for somewhere to belong, to feel a sense of grace. What if that is a wound from the earth speaking out through us? And it isn't something that we can hold or heal or transform as individuals. Welcome to the Passing Through podcast, a show dedicated to exploring those spaces not just within, but also between and around us. The cracks in the walls, the moments between the moments, the silence that stitches a song together. This isn't a podcast about answers or about fixing the world. It's a space for listening, for slowing down and sitting in the unknown to see what might surface in the stillness. Hello and welcome to the Passing Through podcast. These are the first words I have uttered this morning, so you might hear a little bit more bass in my voice than you're accustomed to, and you may hear some more ambient sound than you are accustomed to, because I am coming to you live from a nondescript location in southern Poland. I am on some palace grounds that I can't pronounce the name of, but I decided to sleep here in the van last night because I had dropped my partner Asha off for a training. And when we arrived, there were birds everywhere. It was an absolute profusion of birds. There were blackbirds and sparrows and little green-winged birds that I had never seen before, and birds of all shapes and sizes, and grass and sun and rolling hills and mountains and pastures full of yellow flowers. And forgive me for the occasional car that you might hear passing by. I'm recording this with the door open to let in those ambient sounds and to watch the birds flit around through the trees and feel the sun on my skin as I record this episode, because the weather this morning here in May is absolutely gorgeous. So I figured I would do a sort of old school episode where I give you these lush sounds by recording with the van door open. This also has the unfortunate consequence of letting in the occasional car, so yeah, just try to perceive that as the gentle sound of rolling waves crashing on the shore, which, if you use your imagination, it can kind of sound like that. And I'm going to try to keep this episode brief because, as I mentioned, I just woke up. I'm not really going to be editing this episode. It's going to be a classic stream of consciousness episode where I venture into the liminal canyons and chasms of my mind and see what emerges on this sunny morning. The other thing is that I have to find a place to go to the bathroom. I have to find a place to get some bananas, to make some oatmeal in the car here. So I have some errands to run, and my stomach is already growling, and my bowels are already moving. So this will be a natural constraint on the length of this episode. And I wanted to start where my morning started, probably around 4 in the morning, when I woke up from a dream. And in this dream, I was crying. And there was something really cathartic about the kind of crying that it was. It felt deeper than a sober, conscious kind of crying. It felt like a crying that was more somatic, maybe something that was trapped in the body, some unknown and unnameable grief that was just stalking and pervading, lurking around the periphery of my mind. And not just my mind, I guess, but in the fascia and cells and tissues of my body. And dreams have an interesting way of communicating things to us. The dream that I was having, I was holding a community building workshop. And as longtime listeners of this show know, holding those circles, holding space for groups of people to come together, and these people are often strangers, and spend 3 or 4 days together in a space with little instruction, little guidance, where they move through the phases of a process that invites vulnerability and grief and pain and release and letting go of these things, emptying them is how we refer to this phase in the process. So a dream about facilitating this process provided a natural outlet to let go of some of my own deep-seated grief, I guess. In this dream, my mentor was disappointed with me because I had missed the final circle, or the penultimate circle, the circle before the final circle. And I hadn't explained myself. I didn't even know why I missed it in the dream. And I felt his disappointment. I felt his anger. I felt that I had failed him. And he and I were in our own little mini circle, in a sort of emergency circle before the final circle, where I said that I'd be happy to return and resume my post. But of course, that's only if you'll permit me, because I understand that I disappeared, and this is traumatic for the group. This could open up feelings of abandonment or whatever triggers someone might have about feeling unimportant or not enough. And so I understood his feelings, and I felt my own sense of shame and guilt and remorse about it. And what was worse was that I couldn't explain it. And so it was a very emotional space that I was in this dream, and I woke up crying, as sometimes happens in life. You know, we wake up from dreams in strange states. I don't know if you've ever woken up laughing. I've definitely done that before. It's kind of strange and hilarious way to start the day. Sometimes we wake up gripped by fear or terror, apprehension, longing even is a common one. Sometimes I'll have a dream of a place or a time from the past, a sort of nostalgic longing for something that was and will never be again, because these were distinct memories tied to a location from my past with friends and people in a city that doesn't exist anymore. So sometimes I may wake up with those sorts of feelings. And today was grief. And I'm going to take this as a signal to explore sorrow a little bit for these few minutes that I have with you here. And I've been thinking a lot about grief because the work that I do in these circles is effectively, I would describe it as grief work. It's not just grief that comes up in these spaces. There's also joy. There's also a sense of community and belonging and togetherness. Really healing, transformative, kind of alchemical feelings happen. And everything is permitted. There's anger, there's shame, there's grief as well, inadequacy, doubt. These more ostracized or outcast feelings are allowed to exist in these spaces. And I think that's what attracts me to this work. If you go back and listen to the interview that I had some years ago with my mentor. I will put a link to that in the show notes here so you could go back and check it out. This was one of the questions that I asked him because it was something that mesmerized me about this process. It was this question of why is it that once people are given a container, or they aren't given explicit instruction even, to touch into these wounded, broken, painful, aching pieces of their soul and their psyche and their person, their identity, their story, their narrative, why is it that they tend to inevitably, not always, every group is different, but in general, people begin to gravitate towards an exploration of this sort of darkness, these swampy, heavy, deep, tender parts of themselves. And I think the reason why is that in general in life, we don't have space or permission or feel a sense of safety enough to explore these feelings. So effectively, we put them into a liminal space. And as this podcast is tasked with exploring that liminal space, I think grief is a good contender for an episode. And probably it shouldn't be a short episode like I'm doing here, and it shouldn't be one that I'm just speaking about in a stream of consciousness without much forethought. But doing an episode in that way gives it a certain kind of rawness and authenticity that I lose if I sit to write things down. When I write things down, of course, things are a little bit more polished. They can have more punch. But I think there's something about tapping into an emergent energy, especially on a topic like grief. Because grief isn't just a feeling that an individual feels. There are the sorts of wounds and traumas that span generations. You can think about native peoples. You could think about persecuted peoples. You could think about maybe your own family where there's been a history of addiction or alcoholism or some sort of abuse. Pain tends to travel along a line, like there's a lineage that you can trace it back to. And part of me wonders if there's even deeper senses of sorrow and pain that travel along a living lineage that isn't tied to what kind of animal you are, or what kind of plant you are, or fungi. It may travel in a sort of field. Like if life is an expression of itself, if all of us are born of the earth, from the earth, and we live our life by subsisting off of the earth, and then we die and give it back to the earth for it to consume and recycle and compost and reuse, then everything that is an emanation of the earth and its vibrations and its feelings. What if feelings themselves are not some uniquely human capacity? I mean, to me, they're not. To me, it's quite obvious that they are not. All you have to do is engage with a dog or a cat or watch squirrels playing, chasing each other, or the way that birds behave. Animals are conscious, intelligent, feeling creatures. And modern science shows us that not just animals, but also plants. And there is an intelligence and architecture in the way even mycelial networks move, in the way that they interact with and work together with plants. So we know that life seems to perpetuate itself and prop itself up and express itself through myriad ways. Our world is teeming with diversity. And what if our emotions, things that we think are ours to carry. Feelings of pain and sadness and sorrow and grief and anxiety, uncertainty, dread, these heavy feelings. What if these are just echoes and reverberations of the earth that we can feel? And we mistakenly think that the depression that we're feeling, that the loneliness, the separation and isolation, the fracture, this longing for communion, for somewhere to belong, to feel a sense of grace. What if that is a wound from the earth speaking out through us? And it isn't something that we can hold or heal or transform as individuals. What if that kind of pain requires us to come together in groups, in nature, to our original community, our home? We didn't come from a place of straight lines and concrete and air conditioners. We came from the earth, from the forests, from savannas, from lush, green, living, breathing worlds, teeming with beauty and magic and wonder, and also danger and death. But that's the full spectrum of experience, right? That's the rainbow that we were born into. And I think maybe to really work with those feelings and connect with them and sit with them and hear them and feel them, because our modern culture tries to encourage us. I mean, I wouldn't even say it's an encouragement. It's more of a command to be strong, move on, press it down, put your chin up, and carry on, with a stiff upper lip. And that's not healthy. That's just suppression. That's denial. That doesn't help anyone to really feel into what's going on in their interior world and witness and hold space for themselves and process and permit themselves to grieve and mourn. And this work has taught me that these are vital things. We need to be able to sit with these feelings, and not just with our own feelings, with the feelings of others, because we exist relationally. We do not exist as individuals. This is another false messaging that we receive from modernity, which tells us that we are all separate from one another and we should all be suspicious of and distrustful of one another. And so we live our lives with these wounds, walking around with hearts that are wrapped in barbed wire and booby-trapped, suspicious of love, suspicious of kindness, suspicious of those who show an interest in us. And we live a guarded existence that's detached from the depth and breadth of the types of connective, communal, beautiful, loving, caring, compassionate experiences that we could have if the world were more kin-centered, if we saw each other as brothers and sisters, and not just each other, but the world around us, the fish and birds and furry creatures and four-legged creatures and the legless creatures and all of the rocks and trees. And there is so much around us to connect to and be with that I think a huge source of grief must come from this schism, from this separation. This magnitude of loss, to not feel at home in our world. When you think about it, how many people do you think, what percent of people could you just pluck out of their environment? Most people live in cities. So how many city folk do you think could survive for a few days on their own out in a forest? Without water, without food, without a way to navigate, without shelter, I would say most people would perish. So a loss of that magnitude is enormous. It is difficult to even articulate or describe or talk about in a way that we can easily connect to, because it's almost unfathomable. For a lot of people, it's invisible. And we walk around with this aching loneliness, despair, hopelessness, because not only are we separated from the world, but we know if life is in communion with the needs of this planet, this Mother Earth that gifts us life and gives us so much, if we know that that mother is in pain, science tells us this, but maybe we can feel it intuitively. Maybe there is just a connection with this energetic field and this force that we inherently know, and we can recognize that something's wrong. Like the same way in our body, right? We may not know that we ate a rotten piece of chicken from the gas station sandwich shop. The diarrhea and digestive upheaval and bloating and torment and nausea that we are about to feel. We may not know that that's happening, but we might feel this rumbling in our stomach as a warning. We might feel the sweat on our brow and the lassitude and languor and lack of energy to be a kind of indicator of something to come. But once we're in the thick of it, it is undeniable. When a fountain of mud is spraying and you're feverish and weak and you can't even hold down water, you know something is wrong. But it doesn't take getting to that point to know that something is wrong, which is my point. If you're listening, and that's one of the complications of existence in the modern world, is how inundated we are with distraction. We have these devices in our pockets that are always vibrating. Mine has been vibrating as I've been recording this episode, trying to take us out of the present moment with notifications and reminders and urgent pings of things to do and things to know about and things to protect against. There's an entire industry built around this. It's an attention economy. This is the world we live in. And so how can we sit with difficult feelings and actually listen to what's happening inside of us when we're so distracted? Unless we're carving out time to sit and meditate and pay attention to that inner world, we're going to be mostly disconnected from that too. So in these times of distraction, of numbness, of suppression, of denial, of disconnection, it is more important now than ever to build a bridge back to resensitizing ourselves and to listening and feeling and not trying to fix and solve, because that's another thing that we do in this modern world. We treat everything as a problem to be solved, and most things, it's my phone again. Most things aren't problems to be solved. They are things that are inviting us to work with them, to accept them, to find a way to welcome them into the experience of being a human being. And that involves loss and grief, because everything that you have, everything that you know, everything that you care about, one day will be taken from you. And that's going to happen to all of us. This is the bond between us. This is the thread that binds us. Loss, grief, pain, sorrow. Of course, there will be joy. Of course, there will be ecstasy. Of course, there will be happiness and elation and fun and all these things that we seek. But our culture seems a bit lopsided in the way that it pursues those things with an enthusiasm and verve that is insatiable. And it relegates the other stuff to the edge, into a liminal zone, where we want to feel those things as little as possible and for as short a time as possible. And we need to rebalance. We need to begin to train ourselves to sit with discomfort. Because in doing so, you build resilience. You make it okay for yourself to feel grief. And so I'm realizing now that a longer episode is going to be required to explore this topic. And it's one that I'm happy to talk about. But I think I'm going to revisit this when I don't have time pressure and I can actually sit and give this the thorough think through and time that it requires. So I think a lot of what I've said touches on the surface and sets the context and the tone for what I want to explore. But you could think of this episode more as a preamble. And I'm hopeful that in the next episode, if all goes to schedule and plan, I will be speaking with an expert on this matter. And so if you are curious to get down into grief and how to work with it and why it's important, stay tuned. There'll be more coming for you on this topic. It's one that I want to dive more deeply into as I myself become more familiar with it and get accustomed to doing it. And not only for myself, but holding space for others to do it. Asha and I have a friend who just lost a family member to suicide, and we spent 2 hours on Zoom just sitting with our friend, being there. And it's hard. I mean, I myself have lost a family member to suicide. So it's hard to sit with someone in that kind of pain, especially when it's fresh. Now, the pain doesn't ever completely evaporate. I still have that wound. And when I was speaking to my friend, I was in tears. I was crying. These old feelings were surfacing and bubbling up. And in a way, it was nice to get in contact with them again and to see that in some way, my grandfather is still very much alive and with me, and I know him through that wound. And that wound, in some strange sort of way, becomes a bridge back to him and a sort of gift. But only time and sitting with that and working with it can reveal it. Otherwise, it would just be something that I would want to avoid at all costs and not think of. And that isn't the case for me. But it's still hard to sit with those kinds of feelings and emotions, not just when they're our own, but when they're the emotions and feelings of people we know and care about. Again, this is because we exist relationally. So I know what that pain is like. I don't know what my friend's exact pain is like, but I'm sure there's lots of overlap. There's the questions during a suicide of, what could I have done differently? Maybe I wasn't there enough. Maybe I wasn't caring enough, or I didn't give them enough attention, or maybe there's things I could have done and didn't, or maybe there's things I did and shouldn't have done. And these thoughts loop and swirl and spiral and become this really harmful feedback loop. And that's one aspect of that kind of loss that makes it more painful and difficult than a normal, whatever normal is when it comes to death. But it's hard work to sit in those feelings, especially when they stir feelings of our own pain. And so, if this is something you're interested in hearing me talk more deeply about, then stay tuned for the next couple of episodes. I'm going to go now, and I'm going to leave you with the sound of birds for maybe a minute. Fortunately, more and more cars are coming. So I guess after this car, I'm going to leave you with the silence. As always, be good to one another. I'll be back next week. And enjoy the sound of sunshine.